Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce today my former Leuven colleague, Georgi Mitov, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna and a researcher at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. With other colleagues in Sofia, he recently published the Old Bulgarian Greek and Greek Old Bulgarian dictionary based on the didactic gospel of Constantine of Preslav. And he has also published a couple of articles on the Slavonic reception of Greek patristic authors. And today, he'll be speaking about the Byzantine funeral rites. Georgi, thank you for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be part of the TeTra seminar. Yes, today I will show some of the preliminary results of my research so far. And if possible, I would love to share my screen now with you. And please give me a sign whether you can see what I'm sharing. Just a second. Open the right file. All right. Hopefully you can see it now. And you can see it moving.
Yes, it works fine.
Yes.
Thank you.
This is great. So yeah, today I will speak about some aspects of the study of Byzantine funeral rites. And then I would just love to start with this topic, the funeral as a sacrament. So in a letter to the monk Gregorius, Theodore the Studite includes funeral in a list of 6 mysteria or sacraments, along with baptism, Eucharist, chrismation, ordination, and monastic profession. In a similar vein, funeral is listed as one of the sacraments in the Byzantine Church by Metropolitan Joseph of Ephesus in the 15th century. In the Byzantine theological understanding, the sacraments are the visible form of the actions of the Holy Spirit whereby the human person is sanctified. So in this sense, the usage of mysteria refers to the sacramental rites of the Church. If other sacramental rites in the Byzantine Church, such as baptism, Eucharist, and monastic profession, have been well studied, the funeral rite remained largely neglected in scholarship, despite the abundant source material. But what was indeed the nature of these funeral rites in Byzantium? In his liturgical treatise, Peritutelu Simon Ketiseras Taxus Tiscidias, Ketuncat etus per nimis genomenon, Simeon, the Archbishop of Thessaloniki, comments on the elaborate system of diverse prayers and services for the departed, which after a few centuries of gradual development was largely unified by the beginning of the 15th century when he was writing his treatise. Simeon deals with questions concerning the various funeral rites from the hour of death and the preparation of the body through the funeral service and the burial itself. Simeon's commentary, furthermore, clearly demonstrates that by the 15th century, separate funeral rites had developed for people in accordance with their ecclesiastical and social status. So we have funeral rites for lay adults, for monastics, and also for ordained members of the clergy. Additionally, Simeon describes some of the other so-called death-related rites, which follow the burial, especially the service for liturgical commemoration of the dead. It's important to say that Simeon of Thessaloniki presents the latest chapter in the Byzantine liturgical development in regard to what he calls, and I quote, the manner in which the Church had laid down how to bury the brethren who has departed in faith. So this is what we have in the 15th century. However, this is not the only source. Apart from this liturgical treatise from the 15th century, Greek euchologia manuscripts are the main source for the study of the funeral rites in Byzantine Christianity. A few words about what the euchologion is or what the euchologion might be. So the euchologion is a type, I would like to emphasize, of liturgical book that usually, but not always, contains the 3 Eucharistic liturgies known in the Byzantine Rite, namely the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, the liturgy of St. Basil of Caesarea or attributed to them, as well as the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts. It also contains the invariable parts of the daily offices, especially for matins, vespers, the different hours of the day, the sacraments, services of various kinds, for example, consecration of churches, as well as various occasional prayers, which are the main object of study of the Vienna Euchologia project based here at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. So, the preliminary examination of the medieval Greek Euchologia manuscript reveals that they contain a whole plethora of liturgical funeral texts, which can be broadly divided into three major categories, as you can see here on the screen. The first category encompasses deathbed rites and includes mainly the so-called service for the one who is about to depart, as well as the service for funeral unction. The second category represents a relatively extensive corpus of funeral prayers and services for deceased of different ecclesiastical and social background. For instance, for lay baptized adults, for unbaptized infants, for male and female monastics, separate services and prayers, as well as for ordained members of the clergy, that means deacons, priests, and bishops. We have a third group, which consists of different types of memorial services, which can be broadly divided into private services that take place on the anniversary of one's death, as well as communal services, which took place at specific times during the liturgical year. To this group, we should add the commemoration of the departed at the Divine Liturgy. Perhaps surprisingly, these funeral rites have been studied only sporadically and in isolation. So, we have study of Vitaliano Bruni, and I'm here going into chronological order. You can see in the 70s, who studied the services for members of the clergy, mainly for priests, based on a close examination of 116 Greek Euchologia manuscripts from the period between the 10th and the 5th and the 16th century. Then we have Ioannis Fundoulis, who explored the commemoration service in the Byzantine tradition and very briefly outline its history. Then we have Demetrios Tserpos, who dedicated 2 voluminous studies to the service for the one who is about to depart, as well as the service for funeral unction. We have 2 big volumes by Themistocles Christodoulou, who edited and commented to a certain extent on Greek funeral services in Euchologia manuscripts only on the period between the 10th and the 12th century. And we have Peter Galadza, who dealt with Byzantine monastic funeral services in an article where he emphasized the great variety in the manuscript tradition. However, there are still some gaps in the research field. Commenting on the topic of funeral rites in Byzantine liturgical sources, scholars have observed that some of the earliest preserved Greek Euchologia manuscripts dated to the period after the 8th century do not contain funeral services, but only separate funeral prayers. For instance, we have Miguel Arranz, who stressed that the manuscripts of what he called the early Euchologian group, they are, and I quote, so abundant in prayers of all kinds and of every occasion. However, they do not contain a service for the deceased. Each of these manuscripts includes a series of prayers for different categories of deceased, but not an actual service. Similarly, we have Elena Velkovska, who in a 2001 article highlighted that between the 8th and the 10th centuries, we have no extant funeral rites, only separate prayers. This lack of information about the liturgical context of these early Byzantine funeral prayers puzzled Arranz, who commented that, and I quote, "It is quite unlikely that people were content with just a prayer or a double prayer found in the manuscripts intended to be said immediately after death. A service for the gathered community was necessary," end of quote. Then Arranz hypothesized that these prayers were added to the already existing service of the panichis, which, and I quote again, with its character of vigils, was the most appropriate office for that occasion, end of quote. Elena Volkovska, on the other hand, did not make an affirmative suggestion about the liturgical context of the early Byzantine funeral prayers. However, she stressed that when the earliest funeral service appears in some Greek euchologia manuscripts dated to the period between the 10th and the 11th century, for example, Grote Ferrata Gamma Vita 10, in addition to these separate prayers known from other euchologia manuscripts, there are also sounds, diaconal litanies, hymnography, truparia, canons, some of these canons attributed to Theodore the Studite or John of Damascus, for example, as well as biblical readings. Overall, Volkovska says that when the first funeral services appear in Greek euchologia manuscripts, they bring the stamp of monastic mathins, but nothing more. Thus, Thus, the early development of the Byzantine funeral services has been presented ex creatio ex nihilo. That means the earliest Greek euchologia contain only prayers, and the next step in the history of the rite is the attestation of a full service with all its elements. It can be argued, however, that the available source material in these Greek euchologia manuscripts most likely presents only a limited view of what the funeral rites really looked like. It is quite unlikely that the rich system of funeral rites in the Greek liturgical tradition, as we know it in the late antique period, for example, had fully disappeared by the 8th century and had been fully replaced by only a few prayers. More recently, Stephanos Alexopoulos remarked that some of the early euchologia manuscripts contain also, in addition to these prayers mentioned already, some other elements proper for the funeral service, as it is attested in later euchologia manuscripts, such as specific gospel and apostle readings, a prayer for sensing of the dead, as well as the diaconal litanies. Nonetheless, this aspect of the liturgical context of the early Byzantine funeral prayers has remained largely neglected in recent scholarship. What am I going to do today? In my paper, I will treat the topic of the possible liturgical context of the early Byzantine funeral prayers. For this reason, I shall have a closer look at the available euchological material belonging to the so-called early euchologion, and I will compare it with some non-euchological witnesses in order to get, hopefully, a better understanding of the liturgical setting of which these prayers might have been a part. My paper will be divided into two parts. In the first part, I shall present the extant funeral prayers as they were transmitted in Greek euchologia manuscripts between the 10th and the 12th century. In this section, I shall focus only on the euchologia that contains separate funeral prayers, not whole funeral services usually labeled in a manuscript as taxis and euchologia or taxis και euchologia together. It is important to note that despite the fact that some of the manuscripts are later than the 11th century, they nevertheless arguably attest an earlier liturgical tradition. In the second part of my paper, I shall treat the methodological question of the availability of liturgical information in non-euchological sources, mainly in hagiographical sources from the Middle Byzantine period. So, let's get started with the first part. The first example comes from the famous euchologion Barberini, which is usually dated to the late 8th century. The Codex Barberinianus Grecus 336 contains a set of 7 different funeral prayers. 3 general prayers for the departed, followed by a prayer of inclination, then 3 more specific prayers follow. A burial prayer for a lay person, another burial prayer, this time for a bishop, and finally a funeral prayer for monks. In addition to these prayers, the manuscripts contains also the diaconal litany for the departed, as you can see here on the screen, Diopunica Ischimithenda, which has not been previously discussed in scholarship, especially in reference to the previously mentioned funeral prayers. However, the presence of a diaconal litany demonstrates that the funeral prayers most likely did not stand on their own, but were included in a certain liturgical context. We don't know what exactly the context was. Then, another type of Greek euchologian manuscripts contain also New Testament reading for the departed, in addition to this funeral prayer. An early example of this is the so-called Porphyrius Pensky euchologion, currently kept at the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg, which contains not only separate funeral prayers, but also New Testament reading to accompany them. There is some debate over the precise date of the manuscript, which is usually dated by some scholars recently by Boris Fonkish to the late 8th century, which in my opinion is quite early, but other scholars date it to the 9th and 10th century. There are also two main hypotheses about the origin of the euchologion. Andrei Jacob argued that it was produced in the Greek-speaking communities in southern Italy, whereas Boris Fonkish suggested that the manuscript originated in, I quote, the areas of Constantinopolitan book production. Despite these discussions on the origin and the date of these manuscripts, we can say that it contains a few prayers for funeral. One funeral prayer for hieromonks and 3 general ones. What is really interesting here is that at the end of the manuscript, there are also different apostle and gospel readings. It should be noted that some of the sacraments in this euchologian manuscript, such as baptism and marriage, are already presented as whole services with some brief rubrics, prayers, biblical readings, and diaconal litanies. This is not the case with the funeral prayers, which stand on their own. Another detail is also worth mentioning. The end of the manuscript, as you can see here, folio 146 to 170, contain also readings for various feasts for the movable and immovable cycle, with respective prokimena for the 8 tones. What is really interesting is folio 173 recto, which includes a gospel reading taken from John chapter 5, verses 25 to 30, which, as the title indicates, is a gospel reading for the departed. According to Boris Fonkic, this folio was copied by a third scribe, who was a collaborator, and it was a contemporaneous addition to the rest of the manuscript. If Fonkic's claim is right, then Porphyrius Pensky euchologion contains the earliest attestation of a gospel reading for a funeral service included in an euchologian manuscript. It should be emphasized, however, that the manuscript does not contain an apostle reading for a funeral service, which is a puzzling thing for me at least. Another Greek euchologion, Codex Vaticanus Graecus 1811, provides a further example of a prayer book in which funeral prayers were supplemented by apostle and gospel readings for various liturgical occasions, and also for funeral. The codex, which is undoubtedly connected with the Norman kingdom, contains 3 funeral prayers, one general, followed by a prayer of ecclesia, and a funeral prayer for hierodicans. What is interesting is that this euchologion contains apostle readings for the departed and gospel readings for the departed, as you can see here on the screen. So we have apostle readings from 1 Thessalonians, and then we have gospel readings from John chapter 5. Then we are moving to the Slavonic-speaking world, which is liturgically connected with the Byzantine world. And here, in addition to this manuscript discussed already by me, I would love to mention one Slavonic manuscript, the so-called Sine Slavonic euchologion, the earliest dated Slavonic manuscript. It contains prayers and services that are mainly translations from Greek and to a certain extent reflect Byzantine liturgical practices. It's a glagolitic euchologion. The manuscript contains 4 funeral prayers with no Greek equivalent. What is more interesting is that it also includes a short rubric mentioning an apostle and gospel reading for the burial, as you can see here on the screen, and also containing a diaconal litany. Unfortunately, the euchologion, or at least the main part of the euchologion, does not refer to the exact New Testament readings to be read at the funeral. However, it can be assumed that they were identical with the ones we find in contemporary Greek euchologia. In addition to this euchologia evidence, at least one more liturgical source, undoubtedly connected with the Constantinopolitan tradition, namely the so-called typicon of the Great Church from the 10th century, testifies that, at least in the cathedral liturgical practices, there were few New Testament readings for the deceased. Just as the comparison here, you can see the readings mentioned in the typicon on one side and what we find in the euchologia manuscripts examined by me. Therefore, the examined Greek and one Slavonic euchologia manuscripts dating from the period between the 8th and the 12th century and reflecting arguably an early euchological tradition contain not only separate funeral prayers, it was previously generally accepted, but also diaconal litanies and apostle readings, as well as some brief rubrics, as we saw in the case of the Slavonic euchologion. This might indicate that in the period before the attestation of the first proper funeral service in Greek euchologia manuscript in the 10th, 11th century, the Byzantine funeral rite did not consist only of separate prayers with unclear liturgical context. Still, the available euchological evidence presents only a limited picture of the funeral rites in the period prior to the 10th, 11th century. For this reason, sources of different types should be employed for the further examination of this issue. And with this, I'm transitioning to the second part of my presentation, dealing with hagiography. The importance of Greek hagiographical text for the study of Byzantine funeral customs and rites has been recognized in a couple of studies. Most notably, one by Spiridakis from the 50s and another one by Dorothy Abrahamse. Abrahams dedicated a brief article on the rites of death in the Middle Byzantine period. She remarked that description of deaths contributed to the establishment of sanctity and thus obtained a prominent place in hagiography in general and especially in Middle Byzantine hagiography. Nevertheless, these descriptions should be treated with some caution because they tend to include various hagiographical topi. Another shortcoming of hagiography consists in the fact that it enables us to catch a glimpse predominantly only of the funeral practices and rites of one particular stratum of the Byzantine society, namely its holy men and women, who often spend their lives, or at least part of it, as monastic. Nevertheless, as I will try to show, Middle Byzantine hagiographical texts can shed more light on funeral practices, which otherwise would have remained unattested in the available euchologia sources, as mentioned above. So the first part here will deal with, broadly speaking, mentions of funeral procession, also some psalmody and hymns. So the first example comes from the life of Saint David, Simeon, and George of Lesbos, which was written by an anonymous writer either in the late 9th or early 10th century. According to the hagiographer, in 843, George became a bishop of Mytilene, where he died shortly afterwards. The bishop died in the evening of Holy Saturday, and his holy and wondrous body was carried out by priests. It is important to note that it was priests who were allowed to touch and carry the body of another priest or bishop. In the 15th century, Simeon of Thessaloniki underlined that when a bishop or a priest dies, their body is managed by the hands of priests, for it is considered wholly sacred, end of quote. Thus, the body of the bishop was escorted, and I quote, in splendor with torches and psalms and fragrant perfumes to the august church of the Mother of God, end of quote. Then the section concludes with a brief statement that, and I quote, after honorable rites were performed, end of quote, the body of the bishop was buried. So a very, very short description, but indicates that there was something more than one or two prayers. Similar information is provided by another contemporary vita, namely the life of Saint Ioannikios, written by Peter, who knew Ioannikios personally, and the vita was written shortly after the death of the saint in 846. According to Peter, once the news of Ioannikios' departure spread out, a large multitude came to bid their final farewell to Ioannikios. Then the funeral was conducted with psalms, hymns, and spiritual oaths, as the text said, before the body was placed in a sarcophagus in the monastery of Candidion. Another Middle Byzantine hagiographical text, the life of Saint Athanasius of Aplos. This is the second life, Vita B, composed by an anonymous author in the middle of the 11th century, also contains some references to funeral hymnography. We don't know, unfortunately, what the nature of this hymnography was. Then I'm moving to my last example here, which can be seen as a potential reference to a whole funeral service. This is the life of Saint Peter of Argos, containing an important piece of information, most likely, in my opinion, about Byzantine funeral services. The life was written by Theodore of Nicaea, shortly after the death of the saint in the 920s. According to the hagiographer, after Peter had serenely released his spirit, a great multitude, another topos, gathered around his body. Priests came, and I quote, monastic choirs encircled the holy body, honoring him with hymns and psalms. Already this clearly indicates that immediately after the departure and prior to the burial, certain funeral hymns and psalms were chanted. Afterwards, the priest lifted up the body of the deceased bishop and carried through the town before bringing it to the Church of the Mother of God. However, as the night was approaching, the body was brought into the church where, and here I want to emphasize, the holy office and sacrament was being performed in accordance with the custom, namely the liturgy for a deceased bishop. And this is the translation of Caldelis and Polemis. This is an important attestation, in my opinion, that already at the beginning of the 10th century, there was an established holy office, Hiera Telefti, for the burial of bishop. The text does not provide any further information about this service, and in my view, the English translation of Caldelis and Polemis is a little bit interpretive in suggesting that there was a liturgy for a deceased bishop, and we can maybe comment on this. I'd appreciate to hear your opinion. However, the text clearly indicates that there was a holy office, Hiera Telefti, which began once when the night approached. This can be interpreted in line with Arantes' hypothesis that the funeral service was incorporated in the structure of the Panichis, but this is just a pure speculation. So, to sum up, it has been generally accepted that some of the earliest preserved Greek euchologian manuscripts contain only separate funeral prayers. This has long puzzled scholars who try to explain the complete lack of funeral services in the early Byzantine euchological tradition in different ways. Surprisingly, the early funeral services attested in euchologian manuscript from the period 10th, 11th century already contained hymnographical texts, psalms, biblical readings, diaconal litanies, in addition to these separate prayers. So far, scholarship has not provided a convincing explanation of the origin ex nihilo of the early Byzantine funeral service. In my paper, I try to argue that in the period prior to the 10th, 11th century, not only separate funeral prayers existed, but also some other elements attested in the structure of later on in the structure of the Byzantine funeral service in euchologian manuscripts were already present in some shape or form before the 10th, 11th century. My re-examination of some of the available euchological evidence is an attempt to demonstrate that this euchologia contain also biblical readings, largely overlooked and understudied, as well as diaconal litanies, as well as some occasional brief rubrics for funerals. For further evidence, I looked at extra-liturgical sources, specifically a few Middle Byzantine sources, and this is a very short selection. I hope that my preliminary research showed that a number of hagiographical texts mention funeral processions with candles and incense, as well as the performance of funeral chants with various psalms. Lastly, the life of St. Peter testifies that already in the 10th century, the funeral of a bishop at least was carried out in accordance with what can be called a customary holy office and sacrament for funeral. Thank you very much for your attention. This is what I had prepared for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Georgi, for this fascinating paper and for guiding us through the Byzantine funeral rite, its connection to liturgy, and to showing us how hagiography can help us also finding the origin of this liturgical connection of the rite. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Open now the floor for discussion. If you have a question, you can either raise your electronic hand or type it in the chat. And I think that Albert has the first question. Do I understand correctly?
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution. For me, not so very exploited, but I'm wondering why it was so late that it became a sacrament. And has that to do with Jesus, who said, let the dead bury the dead, and you have to follow me, or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good
Do you
question.
understand what I asked?
Yes, yeah. I think I understand your question. Yes, it's an interesting question. It's a puzzling one because even here the letter by Theodore the Studite, some scholars claim that what he means by mysteria is not what we mean by mysteria in the sense of the sacraments of the church, but what Dionysius or Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite meant by mysteria.
Okay.
So it's a little bit problematic. I know that, yeah, because this passage in the letter of Theodore the Studite is undoubtedly influenced by Pseudo-Dionysius. And here we come to the question, like, what Pseudo-Dionysius understood as mysterion, and secondly, how Theodore the Studite interpreted. As far as I know, this is the first mention in a Byzantine source of a funeral as proper mysterion.
Okay. Yeah, was the
Yeah.
early church not very refraining from divinizing human soul?
Yeah, a good question. Like, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Maybe it has to do with the nature of the sources
Yes,
we have,
they
or the lack
the
thereof.
whole man. Yeah.
Yes.
But I wish you much success.
Thank you very much.
I think Christopher has the next question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me through my mic here?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Georgi. My great joy hearing this sort of the second time a bit since which is good, wonderful, because you know my interest in your work. I guess I have two questions. The first one is about terminology. Just interesting. I think you had a slide up from the Petrol 226, and then also later from Vaticanus Grecus 1811, where you translated it as hieromonks and hierodeacons, but the Greek said monachos ke hieris, monachos ke diakonos. And I'm just wondering, the first question is it appropriate to read it that way in the time, or could this maybe be something where we're seeing a distinction of monastics being lumped together with other clergy as opposed to lay people? That's the first question. And the second question, just kind of at the end of your presentation, where you were talking about the processions and the candles, it made me think instantly, because you know of my sort of interest with Byzantine art history too. You know, the famous euchologion of Basil II, which we only have for half the year, but it does have that lovely miniature for the translation of the relics of John Chrysostom at the end of January, where people are sort of bringing the casket of the relics in a procession with candles. And I'm just wondering if you've thought to maybe look, I know it's sort of outside of really what you're working on in terms of tech stuff, but also like artistic representations from this time of burial type of imagery. Thank you very much again, Georgi.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Christopher. Like, the first question is really interesting because I myself struggle a lot. And this is something I was able to discuss with some of my colleagues here in Vienna. We had a few meetings of the Vienna Euchologia project, and I was discussing how to understand this title, that this is a prayer for monachos ke diakonos. And I said that this is maybe, initially I was thinking, okay, this is for monks and deacons, but then, or monks and priests. And initially I was like keeping this in the English titles, the standardized English titles, which are just for the sake of my own research, so that I can look into the file in my Excel database to see what kind of prayers I have. And initially, indeed, I was thinking that these were prayers for monks and priests. But then what I noticed is that in the later manuscripts, when we already have the whole service, let's say the prayer, which begins with Eucharistumen si Kyrie, which is labeled in these early manuscripts, usually as a prayer for monks and priests, it's only part of the service for priests. So this somehow made me to conclude that most likely this refers somehow to higher priests.
I mean, if I can follow up there, I mean, just so that I think you're right. But I was just looking, even like while you were talking, I briefly checked on TLG and the LBG rather, Lexicon der Byzantinischen Gräzität. And the earliest attestation of terms like hiera diakonos or hiera monachos is like the 12th century. So if you're dealing with things before then, this might be that period where they're trying to, they haven't come up with the one word moniker yet. They're having to say both things. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I'm still struggling with this terminology, and I have to see what to do, even for myself, because now I'm dealing only with the early tradition, so things that are prior to the 12th century, and later on I will delve into what's going on in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. So this might give me some ideas. In regard to your second question, yeah, visual sources, quite important for me. Unfortunately, I haven't worked much with visual sources so far, but undoubtedly something to work on in the future. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you both indeed. I have the question out of ignorance, and I was wondering if I understood your presentation correctly. In the manuscript that you showed, in the Euchologian manuscript, you have, when you have biblical or gospel reading, they're different from one another, and then you have some prayers here and there. So the prayer for the funeral rite. And I was wondering if there is a level of standardization or there are some overlaps in the prayers themselves, either in the manuscript that you showed us or later on. Or instead, every time a manuscript mentions a prayer for a bishop or a layman is a different prayer for...
Yeah, I understand your question. Yeah, this is something I didn't deal with now, and I didn't mention because otherwise it's a whole other topic about the transmission of prayers, about the relation between different prayers, and also like what in liturgical studies is called periphery center, like influence of the center to the periphery. Yes, there are some patterns. So some of these manuscripts, they contain same prayers. Some manuscripts contain prayers that are not attested in any other of these early manuscripts. This is, for example, the case with the Barberini. euchologion, it contains some prayers that are not attested. For example, in the Uspensky euchologion. So there is some kind of interdependence between these prayers transmitted in the manuscript, but there is also quite a lot of variety and uniqueness in these early manuscripts, at least. Or I don't know whether I answered your question.
Yes, you did. My connection froze for a second, but I got
Okay.
most of the
Yes, yeah,
answer.
I could see you.
Yes, sorry about that. We have a question from Dan, and then Alice, and then Marion.
Thank you very much. Very interesting material by far. I'm curious about the New Testament readings. I have a supplementary question. For the New Testament readings, do you get any sort of systematic use of those, or do the same quotations always pop up? Do you have some group of New Testament readings that are used earlier and then they moved on to later stuff? And the second question is, among these sort of readings from early Christianity, do you ever get texts read out for this purpose that are not of the New Testament? I have an example of the 12th century in Syriac, where in one liturgical manuscript, so it's isolated there as well, in copied in Ernest in the 12th century, you get a reading from First Clement, set up for the funeral of the departed. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the first question. Maybe if I share my screen, this would be, is it possible to do it again? So if you go back to this slide, we can see that this John chapter 5, verses 24 to 30 occurs in two euchological manuscripts, which already shows that this is somehow beginning to be a prominent text connected with the funeral service. It's also, this is why I've marked it in green here. It's also one of the prescribed gospel readings according to the typicon of the so-called typicon of the Great Church. It would be interesting to see whether quotations of any of these gospel and apostle readings are found inside the services and the prayers. Let's say, first of all, the prayers here, and later on the services, especially in the canons. What is interesting, and I didn't mention it because I must say I haven't researched it properly, it has to do with the Slavonic euchologion. Because nowadays this early Slavonic euchologion is divided into 4 or even 5 fragments, depending how we count the fragments in the collection of Uspensky. But what is really interesting is that the main part is still on Mount Sinai. So this is Slavicus 37. And then we have in the Sinai New Finds 1N, we have some fragments of gospel and apostle readings, which can be read as gospel and apostle readings for the departed, according to Ternanidis. However, the gospel and apostle readings there do not really fit the other gospel and apostle readings in other manuscripts from the period. So this is something I would love to see more. It's mainly from the mainly from the New and from the New Testament apostle readings and gospel readings. However, later on in the monastic funeral services, there are a few, or let's say a couple of cases where we have also Old Testament readings. I can't tell you what exactly at the top of my head, but there are, I think, 1 or 2 Old Testament readings included in the monastic funeral service, which is quite interesting, at least for me. And I don't know how to interpret it, because it's rather unusual for the Byzantine liturgy, especially in the period after the 12th century, to have Old Testament readings in this context. You know, we might have, let's say, Old Testament readings in certain other contexts, like during Great Lent or at the eve of big feasts, but not at this context. So it's a question for me to research.
Do they fit by reading, by contents? I mean, the Old Testament contention, do they fit there? Are they about funeral things or are more general?
Yes, yeah, as far as I can remember, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So they do fit. The question is like, why do we have also Old Testament readings in addition to the New Testament readings?
Why not? They're there. And about other early Christian writings outside the New Testament, did you ever find anything like that?
No, I haven't. I haven't found any.
I'll
Yeah,
send you the
like,
example. I know.
no, not even homilies. Yeah, we have quite a lot of psalms, as it's mentioned here in the chat, and also the Isaiah. I think is the part bones
Mm-hmm.
Coming together from Isaiah, but I can't say precisely which Old Testament parts are included now.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you indeed. We have a question from Alice in the chat, and I'm going to read it aloud. She thanks you very much, and then I quote, "I'm going to have the classic discourse of specialists in the Christian East, but I was wondering if you'd had the chance to compare the evidence for a funeral rite in Byzantium with that in other traditions, such as Syriac, for example. We do have descriptions of funeral rites from the 9th, 10th century that might give you some food for thought."
Oh, this is amazing. Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, I haven't proceeded further with my Syriac so far, but I'll be very much interested in hearing more about these Syriac sources, especially these early Syriac descriptions from the 19th century. Because as far as I know, we don't have such a thing in Greek or in Slavonic. So yeah, Alice, I'd be very, very happy if we can chat at some point.
Sure. Thank you. I'll send you what I have, because the very early manuscript we have also only contain prayers or hymns.
Yes.
But we do have commentaries on funeral liturgy.
All right.
From the 9th century, we have 2 at least.
All
so
right.
I can just share that with you if you want.
This would be amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Marion?
Thank you so much, Georgi, for your paper. I was curious about the rubrics that you mentioned. Do they point to the performances of the persons involved always? So who is reading what, like you mentioned? And do you see certain trends or certain varieties between the different manuscripts that you presented?
Yes. So unfortunately, the only rubric we have here is in the Slavonic manuscript. So from this early batch, of euchologia manuscripts pertaining to the early euchological tradition. And this is also like a construct, and we have to discuss how to deal with this construct of like early euchological tradition, later manuscripts representing, a liturgical tradition that goes a few centuries back. So we have, unfortunately, the only rubric is in the Slavonic manuscript. So what it says is that the deacon reads the apostle, and then the priest reads the gospel, and then the deacon says the diaconal litany. The question is how much this matches the reality. I think in the case, I don't know, just out of practice, so I can assume that if there is really a deacon and a priest performing the funeral rite, so the deacon would follow what is written there, and the priest would be the one who would read the gospel. But in case that there is no deacon, I can assume that it would be the priest who would do this entire part. So he would be the one reading the apostle, then the one reading the gospel, and finally the one saying the litany.
Thank you so much.
But some more sources are needed to confirm what happens when the proper service emerges and how these things are attested there.
Thank you.
I have another question out of curiosity and also following current trend in scholarship. You mentioned the existence of prayer or the mention of prayer for infants, laymen, monks, bishops, and I'm assuming that laymen would apply also to the women, but I was wondering whether you have some explicit mention of prayers for women somewhere there.
Yeah, it's interesting. So they're not separate prayers in this, let's say in this early euchologia, they are not separate prayers for women. Later on, so yeah, it's like a whole puzzle. So one thing is, first of all, whether the person is baptized or not and unbaptized. So these are like different categories. Usually we have prayers for infants, assuming that everyone who is not an infant in a Christian society is baptized once they have grown up. So we have prayers for unbaptized infants. In this early euchologia, we don't have separate prayers for baptized men and women. We do not have, interestingly enough, we do not have prayers for monks and prayers for nuns. We have only prayers is monachus, and depends on us how we interpret them. What is interesting is that later on, after the 12th century, we have whole services for monks. This is something I can tell because I'm working on this. Specifically, I'm focusing on monastic services. So we have separate services for male monastics, and we have a few separate services for female monastics, which differ also in their content. It's quite interesting because there is one manuscript, if I'm not completely mistaken, this is Agion Oros Kutlumusio, 491, which is an euchologion. And we know that because there is a colophon, we know that it comes from the monastery of Pantocrator in Constantinople. And it contains both monastic funeral services for male monastics, monks, and for female monastics. So we can see like in monastic circle, it's kind of very clear, let's say, gender distinction. Oops, something happened with, I'm raising my own hand. Yeah, this kind of gender distinction between male and female monastics. I don't know how common this is for lay persons. Yeah, at least it doesn't appear in this early euchologia. Oops, I think the camera recognizes my hand when I raise it, and it just, yeah. So we don't have it, at least separate prayers in the early tradition for lay people. We do have in the later tradition for monastics.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just if I'm allowed a small follow-up based on what you say. So if we compare the later tradition to these manuscripts you show us, besides these changes, do you see many other? You mentioned some standardization, but can you say a few words on what happens later on?
Yeah, what happens later on? So it's not standardized up until the appearance of the first printed editions. So it has some kind of like unification by the 14th century. But it's not like fully standardized before the appearance of the first printed editions, which happens earlier for Slavonic, because I'm also working with Slavonic manuscripts. So we have the first Slavonic euchologia, which are part of other miscellaneous, let's say, liturgical editions at the very end of the 15th century, and Greek euchologia largely standardized in the first half of the 16th century. There is the Samuel Bauer in Regensburg, who is working extensively on early printed Greek euchologia. And even there, he can see like quite a lot of things that change and gradually develop. So this is the point when things solidify and petrify. But prior to this, it's quite fluid.
Thank you very much. And on this note, unless I am missing some question or some new question arose from the last answer, I think we can all thank once again Georgi for this rich and fascinating paper. And thank you all for joining us today. And, yeah, see you next time. Thanks again.
All the best, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.